So excited to be here, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about my own personal story and then why neurodiversity matters now and how we can achieve inclusion. I thought I would just explain my path, not because it's really that important, but because I think it is exemplary of the idea that the path is not always straight, right? And so I think that's super important when we're talking about neurodivergent young people and having inclusive environments. That it's not always going up and to the right on the graph, right? And so for me, myself, I think if we now look back in time, we can see that the seeds were planted. I am a child of academics dating back several generations. My great-grandmother was actually, for a short time, president of Mitchell College, where your president was at one time. But most importantly, my father was a professor, and my mom was a learning disability specialist. That's not at all how I got into this field, but it's an interesting kind of background of where we are. So I grew up in a rich environment as far as ideas go, right? So it was always fostered. It didn't matter if I was 3 or 5 or 7 or 23 or 33, that any idea I had was fostered as an idea, let's talk about it, right? So that's part of where I think entrepreneurial mindsets come, that we're raised to think outside the box. So you have here from toddler advocate to litigator to nonprofit entrepreneur. And this is only to show that non-traditional path. So apparently the story goes that when I was little, we had a front porch and there was a sort of, we ended up calling it the speech rock, but it was a rock that you could stand up on and then you could be noticed and talk. And this was back in the late 60s, early 70s during the cocktail era. So my parents were, sipping gin and tonics, but I apparently would get up on that speech rock every night and come up with something that I felt really strongly about, that I wanted to talk about. So instead of thought leader, I would like to say I'm an impatient advocate. So I'm always advocating for something, and hopefully it's on behalf of others. And so that's then I became a litigator where you're advocating for your clients. And then there came a time at which I decided to take those skills and move them into a more personal area, which was helping folks who are neurodivergent enter the workplace. So it comes from this idea that we see that there are present paradigms that need to be shifted. And I'm going to talk about that later on, about what is the need and why do we need to change it. But just understand that it's coming from a place of feeling that if we all do a little bit to change it, what you all are doing here, what I'm doing in my environment, we can kind of get where we need to get. So those are my drivers. But most of all, this is my driver, who is my Leslie Threshold connection. My daughter, Mia, who did not want to come tonight. She thought it would be boring. But in any event, she was born at 26 weeks and was given a 25% chance of survival. And she's, as you can see, this is what the picture I always look at that reminds me that not only did she survive, but she's thriving, and she's thriving here at Leslie. And part of it is because her doctors and our family, we all believe that she had this unfilled potential, right? And so that's my driver. It's a personal driver, but it's also a driver, I think, for everything we do, that we want to hold the bar high. We want to presume competence. And in this case, we're not just surviving, we're thriving. So broad futures, that is what I founded to meet that paradigm. And so what is it? You heard a little bit. It's a training, mentoring, internship program. We're located in the Washington, D.C. area. And we serve young people who identify as neurodivergent, and through transitional employment. What is that? That's either temp to perm or internships. We have about 65 employers we work with, and we've moved outside of the Washington, D.C. area, and we are working with employers nationwide, and we're doing some training here at Leslie. And why I started it was it seemed that young people are fairly well supported while they're in high school, right? Then they graduate high school and their disabilities don't go away, but the supports and the pathways do, right? And some of the pathways that exist are not adequate. They're not properly funded. Some of the government voc rehab programs do not, they have huge caseloads and they're not actually able to move the needle forward. So the idea was that if we have an intentional program, we can move the needle forward. And so that's what Broad Futures was founded on, and that's kind of what we're doing today. And I gave up my career as a litigator because I felt that I needed to devote myself fully to this, and that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years. I did that quick show of hands because I wanted to get a feel for folks' knowledge on the subject, and so I apologize if any of it feels pedantic because I don't know what you know, right? So I'm just starting from ground zero and assuming some of you may not even know what we mean when we say neurodiversity. It's not a medical diagnosis, right? It's not in the DCF, but it's a very convenient phrase that is an umbrella term for many different things that are in the DSM. So it's the idea that those of us who experience and think differently are actually an asset in everything that we do. And there is no one right way of thinking about it. We're not living to the norm, right? We're not trying to make sure everyone is average. We're trying to embrace our differences, and in so doing, we can have a more inclusive society, and then of course we have better outcomes for everyone. And so who is it, right? It is about 20% at a minimum of the population. If we assume that females and folks who identify as non-gender conforming are actually underdiagnosed, and communities of color have also been shown to be underdiagnosed. So it's probably much higher than that. It's everyone in this room, right? It's our family, it's our coworkers, it's our siblings, it's all these people. And why does that matter? Because we're all living together and it's in every one of our communities. We often go to present to employers on how to be inclusive and how to include neurodivergent talent. And a lot of the times employers will say, well, I've never heard of this, I don't know how to do it. And I turn around and I say, it's right there. I promise you the person right down the hall from you is, right? And so we want to make sure that we're ready and that we're creating environments that are going to promote inclusion. So it's not just one thing, right? It can be any of these and more. If you Googled it right now, you would see all kinds of subcategories like Tourette's and OCD and all those things. But in general, we think of it as LD, ADHD, IDD, mental health, autism, and then there are all the subcategories. For those of you who may not be able to see this picture, by the way, this is just a picture of different colored brains to show that. If you've heard this phrase, if you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person, right? It's a spectrum. It's a huge spectrum. I'm going to be making some generalizations today, and I'm always a little bit uncomfortable about that because of this, right? But for purposes of trying to move the needle forward, I think it's important to understand what are sort of the common denominators and what can we all agree are common accessible features that we can use. And I think you'll find out it's what common is what it's common sense. Okay. Again, I don't know what you know or what you don't know. What I do know is that in training folks who have no knowledge of this subject matter, most people don't understand where the disability movement came from, nor do they understand the different disability paradigms and how it has shifted over time. And why is that important? Because it creates the foundation for us to be able to be inclusive and to hold that bar high and to see talent coming in as not a case of charity, but a case of good business sense, okay? I'm going to talk about the two different models, but this paradigm shift that happened, it's really important to understand that that came about by self-advocates, disabled people advocating for their rights. I want to be super clear, I do not identify as a disabled person, but I can identify as an ally, and everything that I'm talking to you about today is based on information from people I know and I love and I work with who are self-advocates. Okay, so I am amplifying their voices today. And my lived experience is what I've talked to you about already. Okay. So I don't know if does anyone know who Judy Heumann is? Has anyone heard of Judy Heumann? I'm seeing some nodding. So Judy Heumann is one of the most well-known disability rights advocates, sort of helped get that movement going. She was featured in Crip Camp, if any of you have watched that movie. She unfortunately passed away this past spring. But there's so many quotes that Judy Heumann has, and I was fortunate enough to meet her several times, and she's just was the most humble person ever. But this one really hit me. If I have to feel thankful about an accessible bathroom, when am I ever going to feel equal in the community, right? Because it hits so clearly on the very basic humanity of what we need to be accessible, right? And so that phrase is born, nothing about us without us, meaning please do not legislate, please do not create programs, please do not tell us how to be without talking to us about what we need. And that's why I wanted to underscore that everything we're talking about how to make places inclusive is based upon experience with self-advocacy. So I told you there are these two models, and we're going to start with the model that existed before there was the paradigm shift, which is the medical model. This is the idea that we see disability as something that needs to be fixed and that we are sick. That how we're going to get there is medical intervention, right? We're going to rehab, we're going to cure those folks who are sick. Most importantly, under this comes this idea of pity or charity. So I am going to open my door to this poor disabled person because they are disabled. Okay. We want to move away, and we have moved away from that. This absolutely does not mean that there is no place for medical professionals in the disability community. So I'm going to use the personal example of my daughter, Mia, who you saw earlier on this slide. She is deaf. She's a cochlear implant user. If it were not for the incredible folks at Johns Hopkins, and we chose for her to be a cochlear implant user. There are some in the deaf community who do not choose that, but we did. For her personally and for our family, if we did not have those medical professionals partnering with us, her life would be very different. And she would not have access to some of the things she has access to today in order to be independent and in order to be her own best self-advocate. So I don't want you to leave today thinking medical model means, oh, doctors are awful. Not at all. It means that we work together with the medical professionals, and we don't look at disability as something that needs to be pitied. Then we have Judy Heumann and her friends, and we have this paradigm shift, right? And we say, in fact, it's not the disabled people that need to be fixed, it's the environment, right? So whether it's the architecture or transportation or housing or educational systems, that needs to be adapted for those who are disabled. And we see it as a positive, right? We see it as an asset. The right to risk is a lesser known concept, but I think it's important for what I'm trying to convey today, which is the idea that with the idea of we're the poor disabled person, we have to make decisions for them. The flip side of that is we empower disabled folks to advocate for themselves and to make their own decisions. They have the right to risk. And I bring that up because I think the Threshold program at Leslie does an incredible job of creating an environment where those students can risk, right? They can walk around Cambridge independently at night by themselves, right? No one is stopping them from doing that. They can do all kinds of things by themselves because we are assuming they can do it, and we're saying it's your decision. If you don't feel that's a safe thing to do or you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. So that's super important. And then under this comes the whole self-advocacy, self-identification that comes with the social model. So that's just to give you background, which allows us to then get into what I want to talk about, inclusive movements. So why am I here talking to you about this? Why does it matter, right? Why do we care about it? It gets back to what President Steinmeier was saying in the very beginning, because it benefits everyone, right? It benefits everyone. Benefits employers, it benefits teachers, it benefits families, it benefits disabled folks, it benefits non-disabled folks, it benefits everyone. The other thing that, the fact I'm even here presenting to you on this today just underscores how much neurodiversity is trending right now. And I don't want that to mean that it's like in vogue and it's a popular thing and it's something that's going to go away. No, it's more that people are seeing neurodiversity and disability in general as part of the diversity and inclusion conversation, right? We are disabled people, have many other identities as well, right? So when I remember the 1 in 5 I talked about, neurodiversity is integral to who we are, right? Who we are individually, who we are as families, who we are as society, who we are as places of education and places of importance. There are an increasing, you can Google neurodiversity at work programs and all kinds of things will pop up, and some are real and some are not. But the most important thing is that they're increasing, right? There's all kinds of neurodiversity initiatives that are increasing on company-wide and then also in education. And for employers, they're really recognizing that it's a competitive advantage to have an inclusive team that includes neurodivergent talent. And the flip side of that is if you don't, you're at a competitive disadvantage, especially right now with the labor shortage that we have. So this is real, this is happening for those students and parents in the room. I want you to know that because we're often scared of how is my child going to be employed, or people themselves looking for work, how am I going to be employed? And we're coming into a time that is palpable, it's real, and people are really looking to find ways to be inclusive. Does that mean we're all doing it right all the time? Absolutely not. Unconscious bias rears its ugly head all the time. And we just have to keep at it, right? We have to be that impatient advocate over and over again. Jenny Lee Fleury was one of the first chief accessibility officers at a major Fortune 500 company. She was at Microsoft, she still is. But this is her quote, which sums up what I was saying. It's not specific to neurodiversity, it's general disability, but it's equally applicable. That when people with disabilities are included in business teams excel, driving innovation, accessible products and service, it's a competitive advantage for attracting top talent and driving accessibility for today's and tomorrow's diverse customers, right? So it's not just for your own team, it's for those that you serve, right? It's also for your customers. Absolutely. This is just, these are for those of you who want numbers and things, this is the business need, right? We know, those of us who employ people know it's super difficult to find qualified people. There's a talent shortage, it's only gonna get worse. If you see this figure of 85 million, it's increasing every year. But equally important is that disabled people are going to be spending money, right? They're going to have incomes, going to be spending money, and we need to make sure we're including that market segment. And increasingly, especially with the generation now coming into the workforce, they care. They care about whether you are an inclusive employer and whether you are creating communities of inclusion. And so it affects your bottom line. We at Broad Futures, we have certain organizations that want to partner with us because they want it out there that they're doing this, right? And that may be their original intention. They want to because they want it's like a marketing thing. They want the communities to know. We certainly take that pretty quickly and turn it into, it should be much more than that. But it's important to underscore that is one of the drivers. And then as I was saying in the very, very beginning, neurodivergent talent is already in your workplace, already in whatever community you are in. So let's make sure we're ahead of the curve and we're making it an environment where everyone is inclusive. Let's talk about, so that's the business need. And for those of you who are educators here, I would just say education's need as well. And then on the other side is the talents need, right? Neurodivergent people's need. We know it's at a minimum 20% of the population. But in fact, we also know the employment rates and completion of post-secondary education is at less than 50%. It's very difficult to get proper stats on each sort of disability category. I think the autistic community has it at about 15%, but we know that there are folks who are multiply disabled, so they're autistic and they are ADHD and they're LD, and they may even also be IDD, right? So it's just know it's under 50%. It can trend down as low as 15%. So what are we doing, right? It's also this idea of underemployment, right? So it's not just getting a job, but it's getting a job that's going to pay a living wage that's equal to what your potential is. Going back to my driver's slide, which is making sure we're meeting your inherent potential, right? We want to make sure we're doing that. And you can see those stats in there a little bit depressing, and so we want to change that paradigm. So let's talk about, we've kind of talked about what the models are, we've talked about what the need is, but why does it help us? What is the advantage we get when we do include, right? I hope you leave today knowing it benefits everyone. That we're looking for neurodivergent strength. We're going to talk later about how we accommodate neurodivergent talent, but right now I want to take a minute and talk about the strengths-based approach. We always want to approach these things from what is the strength, right? This idea that if we have had to think differently since day one, we have always had to come to wherever we need to get to in a roundabout way. We may have had to practice something over and over. We may have needed extra help to get something done. We're going to see things differently, and we're going to see it creatively, and that's what people are interested in, your ability to look at things from a different perspective. And again, this gets back to when I was talking about I don't want to make huge generalizations, and now I'm going to make huge generalizations. But generally, neurodivergent talent is passionate and interested in being at work. And we'll find later that leads actually also to less turnover. But this is something that is being specifically sought out because we're seeing this as a trend. They often don't actually like transitions. They like to hyper-focus. You got to get the right job match, right? But if we get the right job match and we're putting someone where their passion is, they're going to hyper-focus, they're going to be happy, it's predictable, and that leads to retention, right? Courage and tenacity. This is my favorite one. It's pretty palpable. I've been able to watch, over the last 10 years, young people coming into our program at Broad Futures, where, and comparing them to the general population is coming out after COVID, who were completely thrown by what COVID proposed, right? But the neurodivergent young people are like, that's just like a gnat in the windshield, because I've been dealing with challenges since day one, and I know you have to keep at it. So we see that when we include neurodivergent talent on a team, the team itself often becomes more tenacious and more resilient. Energy, vitality, sense of spontaneity, that is not true for everyone, but there is a segment who are incredibly, gets to that passionate part I was talking about, incredibly excited about what they're going to do. And they bring sort of like an infectious energy to the team. So this is anecdotal, but when we poll employers and we ask what are some of the benefits, you will often hear the whole team, as I said before, did better. The whole team seemed happier. We were going through a tough time and we brought in this talent, the whole team seemed happier, right? So that we want that. This is another thing you can Google and see at some of the Autism at Work programs. And in fact, in some defense programs with governments, not just in the US, but overseas, are seeking out neurodivergent talent because of this last bullet, because some neurodivergent talent have a heightened ability to notice discrepancies and to notice differences. So if you have patterns and you're trying to find an intelligence, you're trying to find when a pattern is out of whack. Sometimes it also is being employed in editing, and I'm just giving you some examples. Editing of like pharmaceutical, all that stuff we throw out when we get prescriptions. Yeah. All that has to be perfect. So sometimes it's being used for editing too. But there are Q&A testing, software testing. These are areas where we're picking a very specific trait, and we're picking a business need, and we're making the match, and we're finding that it's actually way better than neurotypical talent trying to do the same thing. These are more general concepts, but I think you get the innovation part, right? I'm going to highlight the last word here, the problem solving. That gets to, if you've had to keep trying at things without a playbook of how to do it, and you've had to come up with it on your own, you are very much better equipped to do that problem solving. Some of these, the bullet on the other slide when I was talking about matching that talent, some of those companies have actually, and other companies have been tracking productivity rates, and we're finding much more productive. And part of that is that kind of drilling down and keeping my head down and doing what I need to do, which leads to profitability. We talked about the greater retention rates. That also leads to profitability, right? Those of us who've had staff turnover at certain times in our trajectories, we know it takes time to retrain people, to find people. You've got to pay to recruit people, and then you've got to start all over again, right? And then the marketing point, right? The positive reputation. I would not say we're doing it for that reason. That's part of the whole picture of why it's working and one of the benefits of including neurodivergent talent or folks in whatever you're doing. We're going to get in a minute I want to talk a little bit about accommodations and universal design. But before doing so, I'm going to flip it and talk about what are some of our barriers and what does it look like? What are some of the things when we don't include folks, right? So these are in no particular order other than this first one, which is if we have an environment that is not inclusive, neurodivergent people are going to feel like I cannot bring my true self to work. I cannot identify who I am. And I'm going to do a couple case studies at the end, but when we do that, we're actually not going to be successful as employees or employers. So if we are creating environments where people feel they have to go to work or go to school and mask who they are, that's not going to move us forward. What if we're in a place where we don't have any community of neurodivergent peers? We don't have a supportive ERG, that's an employee resource group. So that's what we hear from a lot of talent. I don't want to apply there. There's nothing on the website that says they care about inclusion. None of their leaders identify as disabled or neurodivergent. There are no initiatives, there are no hiring initiatives. There's nowhere on the application that talks about disability or neurodiversity. These are easy things to solve for, but these are the reasons that folks identify that are barriers to them to inclusion. Failure to implement accommodations. We're going to talk a little bit about you can't accommodate someone if they don't disclose, right? So that's why the first point is so important. You have to create an environment where people will disclose. But it is in fact true that you can have people go through the whole thing and ask for legal accommodations and then they actually aren't getting them, right? So that's not good either. We have to train. We have to train hiring managers, supervisors. Often what happens is we get an initiative, it comes in at the C-suite level, and then everyone else is like, oh, I'm doing this because it's important to Joe, but I don't really know what I'm doing. or we're only training some of the people and not everyone who's interacting with the neurodivergent talent. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem, right? We have to make sure that people are trained and that they are supported as we start this work. And then over time, I hope what you will learn is it's just being called a good manager, right? What's good for neurodivergent people is good for everyone. I talked a little bit about this. This is one of the biggest areas of criticism. I saw some people nodding before when I was talking about it, that we're given a directive, we're not given the tools to implement the directive, and so how can we include this talent if we ourselves don't have buy-in? We're busy, how are we going to take the time to do this, right? So we have to solve for that before we do it. Lack of a mentor or buddy. So the sort of gold standard, the organizations who are doing this the best are ones that have peer mentors or buddies, right? Ideally, folks who identify the same disability, it doesn't have to be at all, right? It's just someone who is going to be your buddy or mentor that you can have those conversations with that make you feel included, right? Inappropriate, I guess I was looking for a nice word. Sometimes we have a bad job match, right? It is just the wrong job for the person. And sometimes we have the wrong supervisor. We may have someone who either was told they have to be the supervisor or volunteered, and they really have had no training or interest in this. So that match that I was talking about, in order to make sure we're not underemployed, that we're actually meeting our potential, is super important. And that's going to get a little bit to, I'm going to talk to the few young people in this audience about what you can do to get yourself ready for that. That gets a little bit to you understanding what you need and where you're going to do well, right? But sometimes it's something as simple as we're just in the wrong job. That's not a simple thing, but it's something as straightforward as we're in the wrong job, or we actually have the wrong person interfacing with us. The last one is one of my pet peeves, which is where we're going to focus on charisma and affect and cadence of how someone is talking, whatever is a soft skill, their ability to really connect with someone, without explaining why that's important to the job. There are absolutely some jobs where that is important. Think of hospitality, think of a politician. But for the most part, it's not, right? So this is when we're not focusing on the skills itself, but we're focusing on all the things around the skill that are important to us. We are all guilty of this, myself included. I was talking to a fellow, I can't see him, but in here is a fellow alum from my alma mater, Colby. And I was talking about being a philosophy major. And to this day, when I'm interviewing young people, if they're a philosophy major, I'm like, I really like this person. I'm talking to them longer, and I'm really realizing that I'm doing that. And so, stop. Like, we don't do that, right? We want to focus on what is the skill of the job. And if we are going to focus on a soft skill, I recently had a long conversation with an employer about this. It was very important to them because there's a sales function of their job. Great, explain that to them. And then let's prepare. And if that person still wants to do it, they've got to do it. That's part of their job, right? But let's prepare them. So how do we get to the inclusion, right? And inclusion leads to success for everyone. Universal design, so I'm at an educational institution. I'm assuming a lot of you know what universal design is, but maybe you haven't thought about it in the context outside of academia. So it's the idea that when we design for the most marginalized folks, we're in fact helping everyone. It's that idea I talked about in the beginning of we don't change the person, we're changing the environment. And by increasing their access and comfort, it's going to help everyone. It's a basic concept, but it trickles down to very practical applications, which are that being a good manager, right? That is, I'll give you examples of that, but this underlies everything that we're talking about. This is a Think, I had to give the image credit on this because I got this from Think College, which is actually the Threshold program is a Think College program, I believe. But the idea when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower, right? We assume there's something wrong with the soil or there's not enough light. We're not assuming that like, oh, the crocus was such a poor seed, right? That's not what we're doing. And most accommodations, this is not true for all of them, but most accommodations are fairly common sense and they don't cost money, right? That is 90% of the accommodations, and then the other accommodations may cost more, and we will, get the resources to make that happen. But what I'm going to be talking to you about today are the accommodations for neurodivergent folks that are really not going to cost you any money, right? Basic concept to get to an inclusive environment. Ask whoever you're interacting with in whatever capacity, what do you need to succeed? That's not a legal concept, right? The legal concept of accommodations, a lot of times people don't get their accommodations because they don't want to disclose and they don't want to go through the legal thing. But if you had sat down and just said, what do you need to be successful? You would probably end up in the same place. You just didn't go through HR to get there. Neurodivergent folks here in this audience, ask yourself, be always asking yourself, what do I need to succeed, right? Super important. Patience. So this is the most important thing, right? We have to be patient. Unless we're advocating that, we can be impatient. But we have to be patient. We have to be patient. We have to have a support system. I think that can fade over time and it can become non-existent. But when we're first starting initiatives, starting programs, trying to be inclusive, we've got to have a support system, whatever that is, set up. I hope you understood my example, and I'm going to give you more. But if we are not trained and we are not supported as managers or supervisors, it's not going to be accommodating. I don't know if anyone, I'm not going to get into it, but does anyone know about the spoons concept? It's within the autistic community predominantly, but without getting into the spoons. It's the idea that folks who are disabled, neurodivergent people in particular, experience more burnout and fatigue on a daily basis than those of us who are neurotypical. Equally important is that can change from day to day, right? So you can have a day where it's not happening, and then the very next day it can. You can have a skill you've really mastered one day, and the next day it may be more difficult. So we're not always showing up consistently. So it's just really important to recognize that, acknowledge that, and build that into any accommodations plan that you have. We talked about focusing on the skills, not the charisma or affect. That's super difficult if we're in an environment where that matters, right? But we can do it. Clear communication all around, right? So this is where it gets to the heart of just being a good manager. Say what you mean and mean what you say. What are you asking someone to do? When do you want them to do it? And what are the expectations? If you need to create schedules or models, we're doing that to make sure we get there. The second bullet is what we hear about the most for neurodivergent talent as the barrier. They don't get the feedback they want. They don't know how to ask for feedback. They don't know when to get the feedback. They don't want to interrupt their supervisor and bother them. So guess what? If you just set a time, even if it's 10 minutes twice a week, it doesn't matter. You set an intentional time where you are going to give feedback and you're going to receive feedback yourself as a manager. You created a helpful accommodation. Use plain language, which I probably haven't been doing as much as I should today, but be very direct and straightforward in how you're communicating. As educators, those of you in the room know, we want to match the directions to the learning style. So if someone needs you to walk around to talk about it, someone needs a video, if someone needs recorded speech, if they need it written down, we just want to make sure. We don't know what we don't know, so the talent has to be able to tell us what's important for them and how they learn, right? Sensory needs, this is a big one. It's not at the bottom because I think it's the least important. It's the one that I think we often focus on because we think it's the most important, because if we haven't met our sensory needs, it's going to be very difficult for us to do anything else, right? So often it's in the form of light or sound or placement in a room or texture. And just understand there are sensory seeking folks and people who don't want too much sensory stimulation. Both exist, and both can sometimes exist within the same individual. This is one, if you ask, what do you need? Or the opposite, what is bothersome for you? You will get the answers on this one pretty quickly, I believe. We want to break large tasks down into smaller pieces. And this is my little rainbow of affirming principles before we get to our case studies. But this sort of sums up everything I've been talking about. Intersectionality, the idea that we are disabled, we have other identities, and we come with all of them, and we want to create environments that support and foster intersectionality. We want to validate our differences. And how do we do that? We do that most easily by having leadership talk about it, to be honest, and have it be visible within an organization. We want to presume confidence, which I think Leslie does so well. We presume, we hold the bar high, we presume that our neurodivergent talent, young people, however you want to call them, can do what we want them to do, what they want to do. We presume that. If we need to dial it back and give support, that's fine, but we start out presuming that. We're promoting cultures of self-advocacy, right? We're asking people, what do they need, what do they want? We're asking them to speak up for themselves. We've talked about adapting the environment, nurturing positive self-ID. That kind of gets to the self-advocacy part. Prioritizing lived experience, so it doesn't just have to be at the top, but we are bringing people into our communities who have that lived experience. We're not only speaking on behalf of those folks. And in so doing, we create those cultures of inclusivity, honoring all forms of communication. That got to how do we communicate. But the place we see this most often is in interviews. There's some places we'll say, like, we have to do a panel interview with 4 people. We have to do a video interview. We have to do a written question interview. We have to do a gotcha interview where we're not going to tell you anything. And we're just going to come in. And we don't want to do any of that, right? We want to ask the person, what do they need? So young people, what can you do? If you do anything, know what are your strengths and what do you need to succeed? Strength doesn't have to be, I'm really good in math class or history. Strengths can be, I have a really easy time getting to know people, right? I meet people easily. It can be a general concept. What do you need to succeed? I don't read the gray very well at all. I need you to be super direct with me, right? I am most successful when I clearly understand. Learn what your drivers are. You saw what my drivers were, right? A driver doesn't have to be a job. A driver is what gets you going, what makes you excited. And when really good managers will be able to take that driver and put you in the right assignments, right? Understand your disability. A lot of people don't really understand they have a disability and they don't know what it means. Why does that matter? It matters for all the accommodations you are entitled to. It matters for everything, for your own identity. And in so doing, develop pride in that identity. Disclosure is that's a whole thing. We could have a whole talk just on how do you disclose your disability, right? It depends on whether you want to do it as part of your identity or if you need an accommodation. Why does it matter? Because if you don't and you need it for either of those 2 reasons, you're not going to be successful, right? So we want to disclose because we want to be part of the disability community. We want to disclose because if I don't explain X, Y, and Z, I'm not going to be successful because people aren't going to understand. And then we also always want to have a time where we're reflecting. We're being intentional about reflecting on where we're doing well, where we need support. That's sort of the philosophical side of it. The other side of this slide is prepare and do the work. I know of so many young people who are waiting for the perfect job, and it's been 3 years, 4 years. Just go do something. I mean, it can be volunteer, right? If you're having a difficult time getting a job, there's no such thing as anything below anyone. You're just trying to gain experience. You got to have a good resume. Practice interviewing. I have very strong opinions about our interview systems are not set up to accommodate neurodivergent talent. So practice. Ask for questions ahead of time. Clean up your social media. Everyone can find it, especially those of us who like to research. It's easy to figure it out. Create and use a system of support. We all have natural supports. We all do, right? Like my dog is a support for me because she makes me happy. We all do, and it's important to really foster that. And then try out different jobs, right? You saw from my trajectory, you can start as one and end up in a very different place. I have these, I'm right on schedule. I have these few case studies I want to go over, and then we'll open it up for questions. These are just, we have so many, but I wanted to pick a few that might highlight some of the things we've been talking about today. So this first one is what happens when we have bias that prevents us from hiring the right talent, or we overlook talent. So this was a college graduate who came to us. He was in IT, super smart, had been looking for a job for 2 years in a very specified field and could not find one. He had a very pronounced stutter, very altered cadence. Patience would be the best accommodation for him. He took a very long time to process, socially shy. He went into internship class for the summer and was actually one of the most successful interns in the whole class because he was persevering. He did what he needed to do to get the job done. He was prepared. He cared. He was so excited to have his job. He listened to the instructions and did what was asked. He cared about how he was presenting. So he's the main reason why it succeeded. But it's also, let's talk about what the employer did. They were committed to this. They were really committed to making sure this talent felt supported and included. And we talked about up front about all the barriers, right? And what do we need? We need to be patient, right? They went through robust support and training. They were willing to do it, not just his direct supervisor, but anyone interacting with him. They picked a very good supervisor. Remember I said before, inappropriate job or supervisor. Inappropriate probably wasn't the best word, but you got what I meant. This was appropriate, right? It was intentional and thought out. And he was given those weekly times for very specific feedback that's born from a strength-based approach, which means we're talking about what can we do to make ourselves even better. Another one positive case study is when we presume competence. So we had an individual who had an intellectual disability, was not going to be going to a 4-year college or even a post-secondary program. Very difficult to communicate and process, but had this passion, this driver for working with animals. And so we placed him in an animal lab. He ended up, and at that time, Broad Future we did not convert people to full-time employment. This employer asked us, could we convert this person to full-time employment? Not only was he in it to win it, but what was fascinating was the whole lab, who had been very lazy before our intern came, was all of a sudden on time and very productive because this young man never took a break. He just did it, right? So I love that story, but it was that the lab manager, she had high expectations. She'd worked with the IDD population before, and she was like, I know we can make this work. We just got to make sure everyone's trained. So it started at the top, but then we had all the things in place. They presumed he could accomplish the work. Did that mean on day one he was given everything? No. We had it set up in a way that was very intentional about how he was given it till he mastered each category. We talked about the job match. Expectations were super clear. He had the checklist that he had to mark things off on all the time. The team was a very diverse team, and this individual could have been bullied in certain environments, and it was just inclusivity was demanded of everyone, the whole team, for a variety of reasons, right? So that's a let's presume competence and let's have the right match and get the right people in place. Two more, and then we'll open it up for questions. I should have done these reverse because now I'm ending on the ones that didn't work. This gets to why is it important to disclose? So we had a young woman in our program who had the most sunny of personalities. She could talk to anyone, but she for some reason, wanted to do admin work at a desk, right? Really tough time tracking things, tough time executive functioning, keeping things in order, really needed to be up and about and walking around, right? So we significantly counseled her that that's not the best match, but I think there was a lot of family pressure to do this office job, and that's what she did. She struggled, and I got the call of, oh, you're a lawyer, can you help us? And I was like, I am not an employment lawyer. But we learned that she had not disclosed her disability at all, and all of her problems she was having were very specific LD issues. She hadn't disclosed it. It was clear from the correspondence they were setting her up to fire her, I could tell. They were setting her up to put her on a PIP, and it didn't have any accommodations. So we explained, you need to disclose your disability, and then you need to talk about your accommodations. Well, she disclosed her disability and then didn't talk about what accommodations she needed at all. She didn't even understand what accommodations she needed. So you know where this ended up, right? And it all could have been solved if from day one she'd said, this is my disability, this is what I need. And it may have been solved in realizing this wasn't the right job, and that could be the case. It could very well be that, this is the last bullet, that if in fact this job required very fast processing and tracking along grids, if someone has significant difficulty with that, it's that job match. It might not be the right one. We'll never know because there were no accommodations ever given because they were never articulated properly. This is one that just happened this summer in a senator who I will remain nameless. Let's just say should have known better. We had a college grad, competent, poli-sci major, neurodivergent, go in, was trained and supported by one supervisor, and we were told that was the supervisor. We get almost to the end of the internship, and we find out she's actually working with two supervisors. The second one had not been trained or supported. There had been no disclosure, had no idea. The good news of this is what you find out is with disclosure, training, support, you get the glowing reviews a person does well. The other ones were honestly some of the worst I have ever seen. I had to call a meeting to do a download of what went wrong. And we got on the phone with them, then I realized what went wrong is the person had no idea, right? So that we've got to communicate, we've got to understand who's interacting with our talent, we've got to train and support. We've got to understand what does a neurodiverse culture look like, and we've got to provide opportunities for constructive feedback. Because you are disabled does not mean you're not entitled to feedback, and we shouldn't shy away from that. So that's sort of my whole spiel.
When you've worked with clients, have you had to help them find a transportation plan for getting to and from their house to the job placement, if it's a distance away? Because I had a situation myself where I was with an agency that trains neurodiverse people, but they sent me to a company that was in a different part of the state, and I had to pay for transportation. So is your organization funded by vocational rehab services, or do families have to pay? And has transportation ever become an issue? Like, I know that the main accommodation I need is a screen reader, for instance, but transportation costs can be a big issue.
Yeah, so that was several questions in one. So I'm going to start with the transportation. So I think that's good because that gets to level of independence, right? It's super important that you be able to get to your place of employment on your own, right? So how do we accommodate that? Yes, we have to train folks on how to do that. Certain transportation systems are more equipped than others at being accessible. but your voc rehab should train you, but there's organizations that do that as well. We personally don't do that. What we do is we have a mentor model where a mentor would work one-on-one with you to make sure that you know how to get where you're going and that we have it planned and everything like that. As far as costs go, that goes company to company, right? So some companies, a lot more now, are providing transportation stipends because during COVID, no one was traveling, and now we're traveling, and so now we want to be compensated for that, and companies are responding to that, right? So there are stipends. Ourselves, Broad Futures is located in Washington, D.C., and we are a voc rehab provider in D.C., but only in D.C. The beautiful thing about voc rehab is it's different in every state, which makes it impossible for disabled people to travel from state to state. That's a whole nother topic. But yeah, most organizations that are working with neurodivergent talent and employers have some relationship with their voc rehab. And through that, well, some of them, DC actually doesn't provide travel training. You have to do it through a whole nother organization. But yeah, I think it's really important that people learn how to get to work and that we provide whatever the tools are they need to be able to do it.
Hello, thank you very much. So I'm in teacher education here at Leslie. I'm a special educator myself. But one of the balanced conversations we often have to have with our student teachers, who they themselves have disclosed, is that the balance of appropriate accommodations bumping up against perhaps the essential components of the job of being a teacher in that particular case. So how, and there's no easy answer for this, I recognize, that how do we balance that when the people have the right for an accommodation, but does it interfere with the essential components of being a teacher or a teaching assistant in the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think it's a little easier to answer in your specific context because you made it nice and general of being a teacher. We get asked that sometimes like in a specific work environment. I'm like, I don't know, because it's what is reasonable for the situation, right? So for folks to understand, accommodations have to be reasonable for that specific employer, right? So if you are a small employer, what may be reasonable for you is very different than if you're Microsoft, right? I think with teachers, I think though that has to start from day one of these are the essential requirements of the job and can we drive to that, towards that? And if we can't, we're not in the right profession. That's gonna be a mismatch, right? And I mean, we often find that people want to go into teaching. It's the same thing with animal care because they think it's X, and then they get in there and realize, like with animal care, you got to clean up the crate and you got to deal with blood. And with teaching, if you're working in preschool, you got to change the diapers, and you didn't understand that. And you have to be super organized. So I think it's the conversation. The way you can do it in a general way is from day one, be really intentional about these are what is going to be required in this type of a job. You're not talking about a specific environment. And then it becomes, what type of environment is that good in, right? So are you someone who's gonna not do well in a super fast-paced environment where you're thrown into the classroom? You probably shouldn't be signing up for Teach for America, right? I'm not saying that in a bad way, but whereas you may do very well in a small private school that's got a training program. My personal opinion is we have to have the conversation that has to be bound in the law, and that employers are only have to give accommodations that are reasonable. And in teaching are those things that we can learn to do, right? If we know what it is and we want it enough, we should be able to get there, right? Does that answer your question? Okay.
Sorry, these polls, yeah.
Hi, can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a friend who owns a design studio ad agency in Portland. It's very successful. He has a large team. And all of the web coders have requested to work in a dark room and wear noise canceling headphones. And he accommodated that request. And then a couple of months went by, and then they complained that they didn't feel like they were part of the agency, that they had separated themselves and didn't feel like they were included on like inside jokes that were going on in the agency and things like that. So I guess my question for you is, what should he do next? Like, he's accommodated this desire for a really calm workspace, but it sounds like they still want social interactions.
Yeah, so that falls into the category which I did not touch on. I mean, this is really interesting because it's self-selected exclusion. What often happens is people want to hire a neurodivergent workforce and then they put the 4 neurodivergent talent on one project in one office and everyone else. This is self-selective, so it's a bit easier. So we never want that, right? We want an inclusive environment. I mean, he's not doing anything legally wrong because they asked for this accommodation, and in order to be included, no one else wants to be, I'm assuming, no one else wants to be in the dark room with the headsets on. So if you want that, then we're gonna be in that room. But what you would do is create opportunities for inclusion. So whether it's not when we're actually doing the work, but when we're on break, or if we have professional development opportunities, making sure that those are that they're included in those environments. And then getting back to what I was talking about, ask what they need, ask them what they think would be the most successful way to feel included, but still be able to be in the dark room with the headset. What would that look like for them? Because the accommodation thing is a two-way street, right? In fact, the talent is supposed to come up with the accommodations as they did. Now they've come up with another problem, but they aren't coming up with the accommodations. So in an ideal world, it's a conversation. We're working on it together, but I would have them ask for it. But my gut is it's gonna end up being actually not the core part of the work itself. They're gonna have to create like salon style, whatever it is, where you're having that. What they're missing out on is like the water cooler thought, right? And so you're gonna have to artificially, he's probably gonna have to artificially create that. But with them as his advisors, if that were me, that's how I would handle that.
At one point you mentioned unconscious bias, and when you were talking about the last case where you had one supervisor who wasn't trained and who gave whatever the opposite of glowing review is, I wanted to ask, this is kind of a two-part. One, in a more specific sense, in that situation, do you think it was simply just not being on the same page as the rest of the team, or do you think unconscious bias is playing into that situation with that supervisor? And on more of a larger scale, how do you handle encountering unconscious bias, and like you said, you're training supervisors, or even the talent themselves, if they have self-internalized unconscious bias? Is that something where you see a wide swath of different tactics or difficulty in the tackling, or is this something where you feel like there's kind of a predictable rhythm and cadence to the situation that can be handled?
Well, do you have a week? So the first one is, I mean, I like that you said that. It is in fact both, I believe. So I was focused on the person who wasn't trained because I want to believe if they had gotten our great training, they wouldn't. But I believe they were almost annoyed by this intern a bit because it was taking them longer. And the reason I believe that is that what they said was that this individual made different mistakes after they'd given edits back to this person. That is like such an LD thing to do, right? I fixed those mistakes, but now I'm gonna make other mistakes. Not on purpose, this person was so driven, they know, and so that told me that they were just annoyed and they weren't really paying attention. So that is, you're right, that is probably the unconscious bias that they would never admit they were actually annoyed that they were having to take longer, whatever it was, which really wasn't a big deal. But I want to believe that if the person had been made aware and trained, that wouldn't have happened. The other part of how you deal with it is, in an ideal world, it's starting from the very beginning. So you're talking about it in the application. You're advising people, you've got to make sure you're, like, all the psychometric tools that are on applications are geared against neurodivergent people, right? It's not helpful at all. So you're starting with the application, you're talking about how we can't have, how to avoid it at the interview, which is what I talked about, the job skills, give questions ahead of time, don't have it be a gotcha situation, right? Let's say we've gotten through that and then we're on the job and we're noticing it. It's got to be part of the culture, right? You've got to get it as part of the culture that what is it? What do we mean by unconscious bias? So people have to be able to tell personal stories that normalizes it, right? That we all have unconscious bias. What does that look like? And then we have to have, sometimes when we present to employers, we'll have self-advocates talk about their experiences. What did that look like to the person? So we know what it looks like. But it's a process, right? And we just have to be made aware, right? And we have to have examples of it. And be trained, and be supported.
Just pass that down. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm going to ask this question correctly. So we've actually had individuals from Threshold in our workplace, and we have someone right now who identifies as neurodivergent and awesome employee. But it's a very public setting. So it's great to educate the employer, and we work well. But how do you educate the public? Because let's face it, the public can get pretty nasty. So how do we create an environment, not only for the employee, the employer, but the public that's coming in, is going to be understanding?
Model behavior, right? So I've always felt myself as a, and we're not supposed to be talking, I've been told by some, you're not supposed to talk about being a mother in your professional world, and there's nothing that drives me. I think that's the most gendered thing to say, and it drives me nuts because it is one of my drivers. So as a mother, from day one, always modeling behavior, how to interact with a disabled child, right? So you have to, as employers, model for your public how to interact, right? And this public in Cambridge, maybe I have a Pollyanna view, but is the most accommodating community I've ever seen in my life. And so I think it's ripe for that. You've got to model that behavior. And then you can, if it's super public and you want to presume the competence and you want to put your talent in a super forward-facing situation, you can have a, we're a Leslie Threshold employer, and then there's a statement of what Leslie Threshold is. You don't need to say anything more than that. And there it is. My daughter worked at a place last summer where they had, several disabled folks, and they just had there was a nonprofit, and it was a simple thing. It said, a portion of our proceeds go to help disabled people in the workplace, whatever it said. And so people know that if the order was taking longer, or there was a, what did you say? I didn't get it. There was a patience, that accommodation patience. So I'm sure we can figure out a way to get a sticker, get the sticker. Jen's gonna get you a sticker. And then you just model the behavior with everyone on your staff. Yeah.
I kept the microphone.
I know.
Thank you so much for all these insights. This is wonderful to hear about. My son is a first-year Threshold student, so he loves it so far. He's had part-time jobs before, he's had part-time internships before. He's very competent, he works really hard, he's a very enthusiastic employee. He has significant expressive language challenges, and he's also quite agreeable, so everything sounds great. What do you think about this? Sounds great. How about this? Sounds great. So how
are you doing? Really well.
Everything's great. So, but then something that sounds great might be outside his skill set, or outside his, it might take him, the way he might come at something in the end might be fine, but it's not the way somebody else maybe would get there. Or it is outside his skill set, but he doesn't either realize it, or he's just like, I can do that. So in that situation where somebody either can't isn't good at expressing preference or lack of preference, like no way do I want to do that. How do you come at that from both like a placement and an employer expectation standpoint?
And the threshold side, they're gonna prepare him to make decisions. I mean, that's not an atypical thing about not being able to make decisions, but I think at the crux of that is actually he doesn't know what he doesn't know also, right? And so the way we come at it from the employer side is to, they'll all the time say, oh, well, he said he wanted to do it. He said he could do it. He said he was fine with it. He did, that's because he isn't gonna like rock the boat, right? You gotta ask him to repeat back, what is his understanding of it? Where does he think it's gonna be hard for him? So you're counseling the employer on that piece of it. Don't take yes, 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 because the employer would rather take yes, 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 right? Even for some employers, just flagging it is enough. So we have some employers, we just say, he's gonna say he understands everything, he's gonna say yes to everything, and he doesn't understand anything, and he actually doesn't wanna do these 5 things, right? And so part of it is just, that's all you need to do, but normally it's actually having that, remember I was talking about that time for feedback, making sure that we have that, and in that employer is asking the question, let me hear how you actually understand what you're supposed to be doing. I mean, it's a better problem to have than the opposite, right? But you're good to flag it.
Yeah, no, it helps him because, I mean, he'll jump in anything.
Yeah.
And he wants to, which is half the battle.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's good. Yeah. Yeah. Your friend over here. Always question.
Yes, and then right back to you.
Yeah, we have time for just a couple more. It's great discussion.
This is a 2-part question. What about the people that are ashamed, afraid to admit that they have a learning disability because they're afraid that they won't get a job because of it?
So I would say 2 things to that. It's people own their disability status. What Carolyn thinks about it is totally irrelevant, but I'm still gonna tell you. I think that if they need an accommodation for the interview process, they've gotta disclose the disability in order to get that accommodation. Even if that accommodation is time to process and patience, they need it. If they don't need an accommodation to get through the interview process, my gut would be wait till you get the job. And then you say I have a disability, and you don't just say I have a disability, you say these are the things I need in order to be successful. But what was the second part of the question?
About being afraid to admit.
Yeah, and so I would just wanna know, you're afraid because you're worried you're gonna be I'm saying one is afraid because one is worried they're gonna be subject to unconscious bias. And the reality is what our friend brought up, it exists, right? And there are some people who probably are gonna reject you, right? But that's not a place you wanna be working, right? It's not all of a sudden, they're gonna reject you because you've disclosed as part of it, which is illegal, as part of your application. How accommodating are they gonna be once you say that you need the accommodation? But there are some folks who really don't need it to get through the interview and they feel more comfortable than doing it afterwards, and that's fine too. But we really wanna be somewhere where that's gonna be celebrated, ideally. Yeah.
Thank you.
My question, some of us are managers and supervisors, and currently working with many people of color that are adults that did not have the educational system that supported them, that celebrated who they were, and really had to hide a lot of parts of them. So now they grow up and some of them are adults that present in so many clear ways that they need support. But they actually, I don't think, even know that there is this piece of them, as well as like all the supports. And so 2 pieces that we've done is 1, to support whatever's presenting, right? Oh, it seems like, during long meetings, we need breaks, like take as many as you can, right? That we support that. And then the other piece that we've done is to share the benefits of kind of exploring that part of you and what are possibilities around accommodations. But beyond that, what do you suggest in supporting, and what we've seen in our case is some people of color that haven't been supported and are presenting this way that would really benefit from a lot of accommodations.
This is there's many different communities where this is a problem, where there also may be shame, right, around this. And so I think that, I mean, the first part is the most important part, right? You're using that universal design concept. It seems like you've already figured out what the things are. You're accommodating for it because it's right for everyone in the organization, right? But your question is beyond that. It's I assume it's beyond that. You want this for them as part of their identity, right? And they may also be able to get some government services that they're not getting. It gets tricky because you can never be like, oh, you seem disabled, I think you should go to HR. You cannot do that. The best thing to do would be modeling, right? So you have someone who does self-identify, if you can find someone on your staff, and have them just talk about, this is who I am, this is what I do, right? If we model it and we normalize it, that's better. Or we have, you know, some sort of a, it seems that it's for everyone, right? We're talking to everyone, we're not just talking to the folks who are disabled, right? And we're talking about different ways we can explore how we can be more successful in the workplace. But unfortunately, you can't just talk to them per se. If you have any sort of mentor buddy system, I think in that way, so it's not the person's direct like manager or supervisor, it's just if you have that, I think you can do it in that way. And you can talk about, these are some things I've seen other folks do. But they've got to get the resources they need. And they, as you said, when they're not even aware, it makes it really hard, right? But I think you've got to create those universal accommodations, and then I would create some sort of environment there. I'm trying to think of like, is it like a lunch and learn where we learn about different types of people, right? So we're not just focused on neurodivergence, we're also talking about other marginalized identities, and then the bell starts to go off. And then if you can create that environment where people are going to disclose, I promise you there's other people who are aware and about ready to self-disclose, who may be able to be that mentor for them. But it's hard.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've come up against the clock, but these are great questions, and we are going to invite you to join us in the atrium here for some refreshments and further conversation and questions if you have any. I'm going to make a shameless pitch from the Threshold program while I have an audience. If you are someone who are an employer, or if you know employers who are interested in working with neurodiverse individuals, Threshold program, I am here. Please let me know. We're always looking for new partners, and thankfully we have Carolyn who is doing some work with us now and doing some training for our partners, which is really exciting. So I thank you for that, and I thank you so much. So thank you.